Benjamin Lasseter was coming to the unavoidable conclusion that the woman who had written A Walking Tour of the British Coastline, the book he was carrying in his backpack, had never been on a walking tour of any kind, and would probably not recognize the British coastline if it were to dance through her bedroom at the head of a marching band singing I'm the British Coastline in a loud and cheerful voice while accompanying itself on the kazoo. He'd been following her advice for 5 days now and had little to show for it except blisters and a backache. All British seaside resorts contain a number of bed and breakfast establishments who will be only too delighted to put you up in the off-season, was one such piece of advice. Ben had crossed it out and written in the margin beside it, all British seaside resorts contain a handful of bed and breakfast establishments, the owners of which take off to Spain or Provence or somewhere on the last day of September, locking the doors behind them as they go. He'd added a number of other marginal notes too, such as do not, repeat not, under any circumstances, order fried eggs again in any roadside cafe, and what is it with the fish and chips thing? And no, they are not. That last was written beside a paragraph which claimed that if there was one thing that the inhabitants of scenic villages on the British coastline were pleased to see, it was a young American tourist on a walking tour. For 5 hellish days, Ben had walked from village to village, had drunk sweet tea and instant coffee in cafeterias and cafes, and stared out at grey rocky vistas and at the slate-coloured sea, shivered under his too thick sweaters, got wet, and failed to see any of the sights that were promised. Sitting in the bus shelter in which he'd unrolled his sleeping bag one night, he'd begun to translate key descriptive words. Charming, he decided, meant nondescript. Scenic meant ugly, but with a nice view if the rain ever lets up. Delightful probably meant we've never been here and don't know anyone who has. He'd also come to the conclusion that the more exotic the name of the village, the duller the village. Thus it was that Ben Lasseter came on the 5th day, somewhere north of Bootle, to the village of Innsmouth, which was rated neither charming, scenic, nor delightful in his guidebook. There were no descriptions of the rusting pier nor the mounds of rotting lobster pots upon the pebbly beach. On the seafront were 3 bed and breakfasts next to each other: Seaview, Mon Repose, and Shub-Niggurath. Each with a neon vacancy sign turned off in the window of the front parlour, each with a closed for the season notice thumbtacked to the front door. There were no cafes open on the seafront. The lone fish and chip shop had a closed sign up. Ben waited outside for it to open as the grey afternoon light faded into dusk. Finally, a small, slightly frog-faced woman came down the road and she unlocked the door of the shop. Ben asked her when they'd be open for business, and she looked at him, puzzled, and said, "It's Monday, dear. We never open on Monday." Then she went into the fish and chip shop and locked the door behind her, leaving Ben cold and hungry on her doorstep. Ben had been raised in a dry town in northern Texas. The only water was in backyard swimming pools, and the only way to travel was in an air-conditioned pickup truck. So the idea of walking by the sea, in a country where they spoke English of a sort, had appealed to him. Ben's hometown was doubly dry. It prided itself on having banned alcohol 30 years before the rest of America leapt onto the prohibition bandwagon, and on never having got off again. Thus all Ben knew of pubs was that they were sinful places, like bars, only with cuter names. The author of A Walking Tour of the British Coastline had, however, suggested that pubs were good places to go to find local colour and local information, that one should always stand one's round, and that some of them sold food. The Innsmouth pub was called the Book of Dead Names. And the sign over the door informed Ben that the proprietor was one A. Alhazred, licensed to sell wines and spirits. Ben wondered if this meant they'd serve Indian food, which he'd eaten on his arrival in Bootle and rather enjoyed. He paused at the signs directing him to the public bar or the saloon bar, wondering if British public bars were private like their public schools. And eventually, because it sounded more like something that you'd find in a Western, going into the saloon bar. The saloon bar was almost empty. It smelled like last week's spilled beer and the day before yesterday's cigarette smoke. Behind the bar was a plump woman with bottle blonde hair. Sitting in one corner were a couple of gentlemen, wearing long grey raincoats and scarves. They were playing dominoes and sipping dark brown, foam-topped, beerish drinks from dimpled glass tankards. Ben walked over to the bar. "Do you sell food here?" The barmaid scratched the side of her nose for a moment, then admitted grudgingly that she could probably do him a ploughman's. Ben had no idea what this meant. And found himself, for the 100th time, wishing that a walking tour of the British coastline had an American English phrase book in the back. "Is that food?" he asked. She nodded. "Okay, I'll have one of those. And to drink, Coke, please." "We haven't got any Coke." "Pepsi, then." "No Pepsi." "Well, what do you have? Sprite? 7-Up? Gatorade?" She looked blanker than previously. Then she said, "I think there's a bottle or two of Cherryade in the back." "That'll be fine. It'll be £5.20, and I'll bring you over your ploughman's when it's ready." Ben decided as he sat at a small and slightly sticky wooden table, drinking something fizzy that both looked and tasted a bright chemical red, that a ploughman's was probably a steak of some kind. He reached this conclusion, coloured, he knew by wishful thinking, from imagining rustic, possibly even bucolic, ploughmen leading their plump oxen through fresh-ploughed fields at sunset, and because he could, by then, with equanimity and only a little help from others, have eaten an entire ox. "Here you go, ploughman's," said the barmaid, putting a plate down in front of him. That a ploughman's turned out to be a rectangular slab of sharp-tasting cheese, a lettuce leaf, an undersized tomato with a thumbprint in it, a mound of something wet and brown that tasted like sour jam, and a small, hard, stale roll came as a sad disappointment to Ben, who'd already decided that the British treated food as some kind of punishment. He chewed the cheese and the lettuce leaf and cursed every ploughman in England for choosing to dine upon such swill. The gentlemen in grey raincoats who'd been sitting in the corner finished their game of dominoes, picked up their drinks and came and sat beside Ben. "What you drinking?" one of them asked, curiously. "It's called Cherryade," he told them. "It tastes like something from a chemical factory." "Interesting you should say that," said the shorter of the two. "Interesting you should say that, because I had a friend worked in a chemical factory, and he never drank Cherryade."